Hello, and welcome to the next episode of the Live Your SPAlife show. SPAlife is a lifestyle that accepts that accomplishment and harmony coexist. The SPA in SPAlife, the SPA, is for seek power always, that power within you to do your greater work in the world. I am so thrilled to introduce to you our special guest for today, which is Sirena Andrea, and she is a master storyteller, really sharing with women how to stand in their power through the power of story. So Sirena, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Diane. What a delight to be here. Your energy is so vivacious.
Thank you so much. I just came back from a workshop on story, and so I'm all about the story, about people sharing it, and I just think it's so important, and I think it's sometimes a forgotten ancient way of passing wisdom is the power of story. And, you have done this in so many different ways about helping women heal themselves through story. Can you share a little bit more about how you got into the YoniVerse Monologues and how you really started utilizing this platform to support women?
Yeah. I love that you are already tipping off your listeners to the ancient power of storytelling, which we all have access to. As human beings, we've been telling stories for over 15,000 years. Even the stories you're sharing on your podcast are stories. And our brains are wired to hear them, tell them, and pick out things that apply to us. I was telling stories all over the Bay Area for about 15 years before I stumbled upon this idea that the true life stories that women share need to be shared on a broader scale. I had a women's group where we were gathering once a month, sharing about our true life experiences and listening to the ways that we were trying to navigate really a complex human life of family, work, empowerment. And I was also performing storytelling and doing events by myself. And I wanted to do something a bit bigger. So I was inspired by Eve Ensler's Vagina Monologues. But they have been done over and over with the same scripts for over 15 years, and I wanted something fresh. So I thought, what would it be like to gather a dozen or so women from my local community, moms, grandmothers, young artists, social workers, dancers, whoever had a story about overcoming something in their life and stepping into something new. And if I could coach them into their own original monologue and put them on stage so our community could see this range of vitality and diversity among women and open their minds to what it means to be a wise and compassionate woman. And that's how it started about 6 years ago with the YoniVerse Monologues.
Oh, this is such an empowering platform that you've created for women to be able to be heard, right? I mean, in a world where a lot of women feel unseen and unheard, and maybe you feel some shame with some of their story and some of the things that are out there, but to actually put it out on a stage to really gather that power back within themselves is just amazing. So
You're so right. Shame is the thing that most women struggle with, right? Even if it's something pleasurable that's happened to them, if they're excelling in their career, or they've lost weight, or they're having a mind-blowing new sexual experience, women still have shame around the things that they love, and of course, in addition to the things that have gone wrong. And it keeps us from actually being seen and heard because there's this idea that we've been taught that women are supposed to be quiet, pretty, and nice.
Yes. Well, I would love for you to share, some of the stories from some of these ladies. And, I know you've got one in particular that has really shifted, a new level of empowerment for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have had women come out of, so the program is about 7 months. So it's really an incubator for women to be held in their story. Mm-hmm. So they can tell it multiple times, because oftentimes we tell ourselves really hard stories, right? Tell bad stories about ourselves in our own minds. But in a group of women where we're being witnessed in what happened to us, often we can soften those edges and really apply a lot more self-compassion for the circumstances we were facing or the lack of resources. So one woman came to my program last year. She's in her 20s, and she had a horrific story that happened to her when she was in high school. And she was raped by 4 of her friends in the bathroom at a party. And that experience really defined her, as you can imagine. An unforgettable story that she healed so much through. And she did a lot of therapy. And she was even in a place where she was finding compassion for the boys. But it was such an anchor in her life of who she was because of what happened to her. And when she came to our program, often when she would share the story with us, she would just kind of go numb and blank because it was so much to feel.
Right.
And I had real concerns that she would ever be able to share her monologue on stage without leaving her body. And so little by little, we worked together, and she worked with a group. And she was able to integrate her experience. She was able to remember bits and pieces of her story, and she was also able to let some of those go. And in that process became more and more attuned to the part of the story that really mattered to her now. Where were the things that she learned? Where was the medicine in the story? And really, who was she now that was so different from that girl back at that party? And when she got that distance from the past and from that past story, she started to show up more and more in the group. She started to shine more. I also found out she was a musician, and she started bringing her music to the group. So when we performed as a collective in front of our community, she just took the stage. I mean, I still shudder when I remember her sitting down and putting her feet on the ground and sharing from her heart her story that you couldn't hear a pin drop in the room. And then she went on. She was only going to tell twice, and she went on to tell in every performance because she was just gathering more and more strength of who she was. Right. And since that time of telling her story in public and really being heard, she has come out with her music more and more. She does all kinds of videos. She's performing in town all over now. She's writing original lyrics, and she's not just writing about her life anymore. It's like her storytelling has broadened so she can tell all different kinds of stories now. And she's still only in her 20s. So I just can't wait to see what happens in her 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. There is so much truth that just lands in that as far as who people are being. And I love that you use the word medicine because, medicine can have a bitter taste about it. And when you really embrace the messiness part of the life and really incorporate that, and I love that the more she told the story, she could actually just I could almost feel her reclaiming her power, anything that maybe had been scattered by what could have felt like was taken from her, for her to actually reclaim that back into herself and into her expression is so powerful, not only for herself, but what she makes available and allowing for other women in the space that see her courage and see her vulnerability and see that it's the focal point of her strength. That is so amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Well said.
Well said. Thank you so much. So, one of the things we look at here is, when you're designing your life and you're creating, and you had mentioned something about, courageous truth telling. That may be in along of elaborating a little bit more with this story or some other stories. How does that come into play with, courageous truth telling along with vulnerability as a movement?
When I was growing up in my own dysfunctional family with my parents and my sister, I used to look at the world like everyone else had it going on. Their families were together. The parents loved each other. Nobody knew what happened behind closed doors at my house. And as I've grown up and I've had those kind of edgy conversations where I've shared, not everything is great at home. This is what I struggle with. This is what it was like for me. I find that other people often share what has been dysfunctional or difficult in their life. And I find that in those conversations, there's a shared humanity around what it's like to be a human being, what it's like to live through a dysfunctional family or divorce or a loss of a child, right? The truth is, human beings, we all suffer from loss or tragedy. Even if our lives are really blessed, and I've met some people like that who like their lives have been really, really blessed, at some point something will be lost. And there's a way that when we share that with each other, we like lean in, because our hearts are naturally wired for compassion. And the vulnerability piece, I mean, I just think it's really vulnerable to say, right? My life hasn't always been perfect, or I suffered from depression after the loss of my grandmother, right? These things that happen to us, we don't usually talk about that. And when we do, something shifts altogether. A shared vulnerability starts to open up, a softness maybe, and definitely courage, right? Courage to say, yes, this happened, and maybe even if you're lucky, this is what I did to get out of it.
Right, right. Yeah, there's so many things that come up around this. You know, our mutual friend Sayeda, you know, she has mentioned about, you know, you can have a victim experience, but you don't have to identify yourself as a victim. And I find that is such a powerful stance, because we've all had, you know, different levels of what may be considered a victimhood, no matter how you look at it. But who we are being and who we go forward with, you know, can define the next path for us and where we go with that, and all the stories that we take with us and what we make that mean about ourselves and what that can look like as part of it. And the other aspect, and I really got a huge education for myself when I was in law enforcement, being in law enforcement for 10 years, you know, and then there's the undercover part. So I worked undercover. So not only, you know, in gangs, but like in Vice as an undercover prostitute. So that's also another way of, like, as a woman, of who you're being in the world and what you see. But the part of when I was like in patrol, I was in thousands of homes, and it was, you know, socioeconomic really didn't come into play. I mean, there were poor homes and very wealthy homes, and the behind the scenes of what people wouldn't want anyone to see about their life. It's amazing, because what we see, I mean, even people who are looking at us here, you know, there's some people who are just going to be listening to the show, but those who can see us, they're like, oh, they look put together and pretty and life is going well. And there's all these things, not knowing what the backstory is, right? Of what has happened in our lives and what has defined us. And that's one of the things that I so appreciate about the work that I did, was I really got to see how vulnerable people feel when they're truly seen. And where is it in our society where we give ourselves permission to let that be seen? And I don't know if you're seeing that in the work of women, you know, going through your program and being on your stage, of allowing themselves to be seen.
Life is such a paradox when it comes to being seen, right?
Yeah.
Because as women in particular, there's a great need to be seen. See me. See the work I've done. See how I've sacrificed to raise my children. See the work I've done in my career and raising a family, right?
Yes.
There's a real for that. And then once you get seen, it's really vulnerable. Oh God, now I'm being seen. Oh, how do I do that? And I think really honestly, life is a giant paradox. It's all of it.
Right.
Being seen, not being seen, heartache, falling in love. How do we expand big enough to hold paradox? And one of the ways I do that with my women in my troupe is to have them get in their bodies more, be more embodied, not just in their head. Right? Because when we're in our head, a paradox is a this or a that. It's I have to choose. I'm either good or I'm bad. I either speak out or I'm silent. Our mind is always choosing a black and white world.
Right.
So when we're in our head, that's what we're left with. But when we drop down into our hearts and into our bodies, then we have more range of like, all of this is life. All of these things are included. And then the shame starts to melt away that you have had a very complex human experience instead of just this narrow, like doing it the right way. That's just an illusion.
Right. Well, it's like the melodies and the harmony of life, right? Of just having all the different nuances. If we had only all the light notes, then just think about music, right? I mean, music wouldn't have that base and that foundation, and all of it, when it's played together, that's where, you know, the beauty comes from, is from having all of it and to embrace all of it. So I love that this is a forum that women have to be part of that. I'd love to know how like creative risk comes into play here. How is it that, that works with yourself and your ladies.
Oh, risky business being creative. Risky business. If you want a nice normal life and you want things to hum along in one note, then like don't be creative. But that hasn't been my path.
Right.
When I created the YoniVerse Monologues, I saw it as being a producer. I was going to produce this event and I was going to create a stage for the women in my community. And I was going to be behind the scenes. But that's not what happened. I have a very strong and vocal muse, and she was like, you're telling a story. It's you two. You need to take the same risks that your women are taking. Otherwise, you won't understand each other. So every year I craft my own original monologue and I share right along with the women. And the risk every year of bringing myself forth as I evolve into what the next thing is, allows me to access my aliveness in a way that nothing else has.
Yeah.
Being alive is something that's really important to me, to feel aliveness, right? To keep me going into something new. And I watch with the women that come, especially the older women, the women 40 plus, like our oldest teller, I think was 74. Like those women inspire the hell out of me because they're still like, they're looking for their next creative edge. Like, what could I do that would be enlivening, new, enriching? What could I bring forth? And when they tell their stories, like, yeah, just mind blowing.
That's so great. I love that so much. What has been, I mean, it's so amazing that you have really, not only embraced this work yourself, but to really explore each season, what is a different, flavor of yourself or a different story or a different way you're presenting how you're a version of yourself. What in that exploration has been a surprise to you? Anything that has been revealed to you or something that, maybe one of your favorite things or just, it feels like in that creative messiness, if you will, that some things would have been revealed to you.
What I notice is that the story that I tell myself about what I've experienced is different than the story that's emerging right now. There's a difference between my past and my now. And in my head, I often create my now from my past. So for example, I had a really hard breakup with a man I was with for 10 years. And that changed the configuration of my heart. And when I tell the story about our breakup, there are key moments that I always go back to that I wish I could have changed or that were really heartbreaking. So I tell the story of the past in the same way over and over till it almost galvanizes itself.
Okay.
But the truth is that happened many years ago. And who I am now is very different. So when I start to tell a story of the past, I have noticed that if I'm not careful, I will project myself into the past with no change at all, with no witnessing or bringing any flavor into my story of what I've created now or who I've become or what my heart is capable of now. And I miss me now altogether. And the risk for anyone who keeps telling themselves a story of the past that's concretized is they don't catch up with who they are now. And so when I go back and I get a story from the past and I bring it forth to tell every new year, it challenges me to look at myself with fresh eyes.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of bring all of that together? Because, are you telling it completely from the perspective of how you were in that story as far as authentically in the moment of that? Or are you bringing the wisdom pieces of now that trickle into that story?
I love it. See, how can I break this down? Because I've been geeking out on storytelling for so long. Like I can go down the rabbit hole, which is why I have, a longer time that I spend with my clients. So I'm like, it's this and it's that. And the most effective storytelling that engages our audience and creates connection is when we tell a story as if we're inside of it. we're walking along right in it with them, with details and sensory explanation, and so people can feel it.
Yeah.
However, when we sprinkle that with some of the wisdom, with things like what I wish I would have known then was, or if I had known then that making that choice was going to lead me here. Mm-hmm. When we sprinkle that wisdom in, then it texturizes our story, right? And it brings in another piece of our medicine, because wisdom is usually mistakes you made in the past that you wouldn't make again. Right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. My experience is everybody wants wisdom without making all the mistakes, but that's not actually where it comes from.
Right. Yeah. It's so true. Oh my gosh.
I mean, we know not to do things, or we know to do things, right? We know that, like, things like being patient, respecting our bodies, these kinds of things we know to be true, even though they're hard to do. And we usually got that because in the past we didn't do that. We had a breakdown, or we had a breakup, or something fell apart. Like, oh, if I just been more truth, if I told more truth, things would have been different.
Right. But then maybe the lesson would have been lost along the way, that you now apply now.
Exactly.
So that can be part of it. One of the things that was shared with me is that one of the most vulnerable aspects of storytelling is that you are going back and you are retelling that story from the eyes that experienced it, that is a true experience of what's happened in that place. The vulnerability comes into you because your wisdom part of you knows what you've learned in this, and going back to that can feel really challenging, and vulnerable, because you know that you've evolved from that place.
Yeah.
And to go back there can sometimes maybe even feel trapped in that energy, or feel back in that energy. And, you're literally like reliving it. So all the emotions and all the things that were going on and all the experiences of that. How do you help women kind of coach them through that, where they are really literally reliving sometimes the most challenging aspects of their life, and to be able to really, that's their gift that they're giving out in the world, is this, experience of all of them, and to put that into the perspective of where they are now.
Yeah, totally. So we had a teller who worked with us, and her story, part of her story that she was sharing was that when she was with her husband, she didn't feel any sexual attraction to him. Yet when he made love with her, she would let him. And she would tell this experience of lying in bed, feeling numb and cold, and he would climb on top of her, and she would basically just leave her body.
Right.
She had so much shame about that experience, because now she would never let that happen, that she would relive all the frozenness of it. And one of the ways that storytelling is so healing, by retelling those stories, some of them traumatic, is that we create a space where we're not trying to fix her. When our group listens, we are listening with loving eyes. We do nothing but hold space quietly while she retells. And what often happens is a woman will start to melt. She'll cry. Sometimes she gets angry, right? She's like cursing, like, why the hell did that happen? Sometimes she'll go numb, and then she'll fall into another woman's lap quietly and just be held for a while. Right? We all need something different in that melting process.
Right.
And we don't often get that in our fast-paced world. So we really create that listening space. And it's happening all over. I just heard about a project that's happening in Monterey for Vietnam vets, where they're retelling their stories of being at war. And the only thing that they're doing is the person who's listening is writing down their story, and then they repeat back to them word for word everything that their story was. Not adding anything, not adding any I'm sorries, or I wish that were better, you should read a book, take some echinacea, right? They're not saying anything like that. They're just listening. And the Vietnam vets are starting to like melt, right? Because there's a certain amount of protection we all put onto ourselves around the things that have hurt.
Right.
Basically, there's a lot about not being judged, but there's also, there's this piece around, like, we're attached to our suffering.
Right.
We're attached to the things that happened to us that shook us to our core, because usually that happened around something that mattered, that was life and death.
Right.
And we're not just going to let that go because someone listened. We need someone really listening.
Right. This is such a critical conversation around the listening aspect. You know, my friend, she has a quote in one of her books, Vicky Fitch, where she talks about the healing happens in being heard, you know, and that, you know, being heard is such a powerful thing that happens. And Chris Voss, who was the head negotiator for kidnapping for the FBI for many years, talks about that when that more importantly than someone who is like who's been involved in kidnapping or any type of ransom type thing, that they would say that it wasn't that they wanted someone to believe in what they had to say, they wanted to be heard. And if they could express that you heard what they had to say, regardless of whether you agreed with it or not, almost 100% of the time that the person that was kidnapped was released because that person just wanted to be heard.
Wow, that's deep. That's
Yeah.
really deep. I can't imagine the kind of stories that you've heard in your work. Like, whoa, oh, like outrageous things.
Right.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because when I was in Costa Rica many years traveling, I met a girl that had been kidnapped. And I was instrumental in telling a story to the FBI that actually brought her back to her family. She'd been abducted at 4, and I met her when she was 6.
Right.
And so the power of storytelling is beyond the scope of my imagination most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I'm using the platform a lot more myself as well because, you know, I have a lot of distance from when I retired from the police department, but there's a lot of things that happened along the way that are things that can support women. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm having, you know, my live event is really how do I share my undercover experiences that really can impact women today and what's happening with them. And, you know, briefly, one of the things that happened while I was on the department is I was in a very unhealthy relationship. And I had my own, you know, shame and blame and thoughts about of all people that would know better who went to domestic violence calls, who went to all of these tragic things, to not apply to some of that within myself. There was a lot of healing and things happening around that. And I think it's so important to share these kind of stories with women so they don't feel like they're alone, because, you know, people will look at us and they'll, you know, even looking at, you know, people watching our show today, they'd be like, oh, looks like they got it all figured out, right? And not know our backstory and not know the things that we've moved through and how we utilize this. And this is why these kind of things are so important, to have women be heard.
Yeah. And the ways we still struggle, right? I mean, since we are human beings, we have good days and bad days. Sickness and death and heartbreak still come to us, even if we've managed to pay our rent and show up for our work, right? These things still happen. And how do we really bring our best selves forward, which you obviously are, which is a delight.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Well, our time goes so quickly here. I know that you have a free gift for our listeners, and I know that they're going to want to stay in contact with you. How can they do that?
Oh, great. I would love it. So they can search my name, SirenaAndrea.com, where my free gift is. And my free gift is a free 30-minute session where I help you have a story breakthrough. I help women tell stories on stage. I have helped women do one-woman shows, and I also help women take their personal life story and use it in their business, which is becoming more and more a vehicle for connection with the people that they love to work with. Oh. And if they want to come to the YoniVerse Monologues, that would be a joy.
Oh, how fun. And all that information's on your website?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, we will put that into the show notes. And actually, before I forget, one of the things I love to ask my guests on the show, because I think environment is such a powerful thing about how we feel in the different spaces. We feel different in a bedroom versus a kitchen versus an office. So what is your favorite room in your home and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Wow. I think it's the space between my houses. So I have my office in one part of my house and I have my bedroom in the other, and there's a big patio between them. And that to me feels like my outdoor room. And I often go out there and I'll meditate or I'll dance between calls, and I have a view of the apple orchard, and I think that's my favorite room.
I love that so much. I love the uniqueness of what people have as their favorite thing in their space, and it's creating these sacred spaces within our home. And I love that yours is in between your home, and that's just so fun. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, you're welcome. You're
Good.
welcome.
It was wonderful having you on the show. I just thank you so much for your time.
Oh, what a delight to be here. And to everyone who's listening, I just want to remind everyone to tell good stories about yourself. There's so many stories that we can tell about our experiences, but to remember to tell good ones about yourself.
Oh, that is such a powerful, remembrance, right, of how we do that, the good stories. I like it. So good. Perfect. Well, thank you again, and thank you to our listeners for being here. The time that you take to be here just means so much to us. That's our precious resources, our time, so we really appreciate that being here. And also, depending whatever platform that you're watching this on, please put into the comments, what is something you learned about today, or what's something that you want to add into your life, or maybe you want to share something about your story. I mean, let's utilize this community to really be more vocal. I mean, this is about getting our stories out. And if you have a question for either myself or Sirena, please tag both of us in here so that we can, respond to you and answer any of your questions. And part of building community is getting the word out. And one of the things that you can do is to, subscribe to the show, and also to share it with your friends. Really get the word out there. It's how we really expand in the world, is building our community to support each other. And, women in business in particular, it can be lonely in your own home by yourself and not feel like you have the support. And so things like this that you can do to get outside of yourself, whether it's telling your story or really learning more about yourself. And I'll also put in the show notes about my free gift, about the liferesetquiz.com, about really having some awareness about what's working and not working in your life. So lots of resources for you here. So make sure you check out the show notes there. And until we connect again, live your spa life. Bye for now. See you.